I didn't cry. I didn't shake. I stood in the break room of Castellan Financial with my lunch going cold on the counter and read the message twice, very slowly, and then I set my phone face down on the table and finished my sandwich. That was the moment my manager's son decided to fire me. A Thursday in February, 13 days before my promotion was supposed to be announced. I had been at Castellan for 6 years. 6 years of arriving early, staying late, covering shifts for people who never once covered mine. 6 years of building the client portfolio in the Sudbury branch from 42 accounts to over 200. My direct manager, a man I'll call my boss, had been in the company since before I was born. He was fair, methodical, the kind of man who kept a handwritten ledger on his desk, even though everything had been digital for a decade. I respected him. I still do. His son was a different story. His son had joined the company 18 months ago with a business degree from a school he mentioned in every third sentence and no actual experience managing anything more complicated than his own calendar. From the day he walked in, it was clear he saw the Sudbury branch as a proving ground, something to optimize. And I was, in his mind, part of the furniture, useful enough to keep around until something shinier came along. The promotion had been in the works for almost a year. My boss had told me directly in his office, with the door closed, that I was the only candidate being considered for regional client lead. It came with a salary jump from $68,000 to $91,000, a company car allowance, and oversight of 4 junior advisors. It was the role I had been quietly building towards since my second year. I had turned down an offer from a competitor in Oakville the previous spring, specifically because I believed this was coming. Then my boss had a cardiac event in late January. Not fatal, thank God, but serious enough that he was placed on medical leave indefinitely. His son stepped in as acting manager. Within 3 weeks, the atmosphere in the office changed completely. The son, I'll call him Preston throughout because that's the energy, started arriving at 9, leaving at 3, taking long lunches with clients I had brought to the firm, and presenting my work in meetings as if the ideas had occurred to him in the shower. I kept documentation. I kept my head down. I told myself it was temporary. The message came on a Thursday at 12:47 in the afternoon. It read, "Your position is being restructured, effective immediately. I've spoken with HR. You'll receive a formal letter today. Consider this your notice. P." No phone call, no meeting. A text message. I read it twice. I set my phone down, I finished my sandwich, and then I walked to my desk, opened my laptop, and sent a single email to a personal address I had set up 3 months earlier, just in case. An email that contained, as attachments, every piece of documentation I had accumulated since the day Preston arrived. Client records with my name on them. Email chains. Meeting notes. A photograph of the presentation he had delivered in November that contained, word for word, a strategy memo I had written in September. I had been careful. I had been quiet, but I had not been unprepared. My desk neighbor, I'll call her my friend because that's what she is, looked up from her monitor when I sat down. She had seen my face. She knew. "He actually did it," she said. It wasn't a question. "He actually did it," I said. She pressed her lips together and looked toward his office. "What are you going to do?" I opened my email, found the formal termination letter that had arrived 4 minutes after his text, and forwarded it to the same personal address. Then I closed my laptop and said, "I'm going to finish the afternoon, and then I'm going to handle it." She stared at me for a long moment. Then she said, "You already have something, don't you?" I didn't answer. I just started packing my desk drawer. The afternoon was surreal in the way that only truly absurd situations can be. Preston did not come out of his office. I returned 3 client calls, filed 2 reports, and at 4:30, I shook hands with the 2 junior advisors I had been quietly mentoring for the past year. One of them, a 23-year-old from a small town outside Sudbury who had moved to the city for this job, looked like he was going to cry. I told him to keep his documentation too. He nodded like he understood exactly what I meant. I walked out into a February that was doing what February in Northern Ontario always does, which is to say it felt personal. The cold had teeth. My car took 4 minutes to warm up. I sat in the parking lot and finally, let myself feel it. Not crying exactly, but that full body tightness that comes when something you work toward for 6 years gets taken from you by someone who has been alive for 6 years less than that. Then I called my sister. My sister is 4 years older than me and has spent the last decade working in employment law. Not as a lawyer herself. She works as a senior paralegal at a firm in Toronto. But she knows the landscape. She knows what matters and what doesn't. I had actually called her 3 months earlier, when Preston first started pulling the moves he was pulling, and she had told me then, document everything, say nothing, wait. He did it, I said when she picked up. She was quiet for exactly 2 seconds. Then, okay. Send me the termination letter tonight. Do not respond to anything he sends you. Do not post anything. Do not say anything to anyone at the company that you wouldn't want read out in a hearing. I already sent you the documentation file. Another pause. How much is in it? Enough, I said. She exhaled slowly. Okay, I'm going to make some calls. Here's what I had not told Preston, had not told anyone at the office except my friend, and had not told even my mother until that evening. My boyfriend had spent the last 2 years working as a compliance officer at a financial regulatory body. Not Castellan. Not even adjacent to Castellan. But compliance is compliance. And when I had first started telling him about the pattern I was seeing with Preston, he had gotten very quiet and said, "That sounds like more than a management problem." We had spent several evenings over the winter going through what I had documented. He knew people, he knew processes, he knew what a formal complaint to the right body looked like and what it could produce. Preston, when he fired me by text message in February, did not know any of this. I went home. I made dinner. I talked to my boyfriend for 2 hours. My sister called back at 9 and said she had spoken to a colleague who specialized in wrongful dismissal and wanted to see the full file. I sent everything, all of it, the memo, the email chains, the client transfer records that showed 6 accounts reassigned from my portfolio to Preston's name in the 3 weeks since he had taken over, the meeting notes from a January conversation in which my boss recorded, with his knowledge, because I had asked to record it from my personal files, had confirmed the promotion in specific terms including the title, the salary, and the start date. The start date had been February 14th. Preston fired me on February 1st. My sister's colleague reviewed everything over the weekend and called me on Monday morning. She was direct. This was a strong wrongful dismissal case with additional elements that pointed toward potential labor code violations. The reassignment of my client accounts without documentation, without my signature, potentially without proper HR process, was a separate issue. The use of my strategy materials in a presentation attributed to Preston was a third issue. She wanted to proceed. I said yes. I want to be honest about what the next 6 weeks felt like because it wasn't triumphant. It was exhausting and strange, and there were nights when I sat on my couch and wondered if I should have just taken the termination letter and moved on. I applied for other positions. I interviewed at a firm in Oakville, the same one that had approached me the year before, and they offered me a role within 2 weeks. I accepted it, partly because I needed the income and partly because I needed somewhere to be. But the process continued quietly in the background. The thing about working in financial services in a mid-sized Canadian city is that the professional community is genuinely small. My boss, still on medical leave, had heard through his wife what his son had done. He called me in the 3rd week of February. I had been told by my sister not to discuss the legal matter, so I was careful, but I listened to what he said. He was apologetic in a way that felt real. He said he had reviewed the client files remotely and had questions for HR that he intended to pursue when he returned. He asked if I was all right. I told him I had landed somewhere good. He said quietly, He didn't know what he was taking on with you. I didn't say anything to that, but I wrote it down afterward because that's the kind of thing you want to remember. The regulatory inquiry that my boyfriend helped initiate ran on a separate track from the civil case. I won't go into the details publicly, but the short version is that the reassignment of client accounts the way Preston had done it, without proper documentation, without quiet notification, in a way that served his performance metrics directly, attracted attention it would not have attracted otherwise. The firm's compliance team was notified, and internal review was launched. Preston, from what I understand, had no idea any of this was coming. He had sent me a text message on a Thursday afternoon and assumed that was the end of it. He was 31 years old. He had been acting manager for less than a month, and he had spent that month using his father's absence as a vehicle to consolidate accounts, dismiss the person who had built those accounts, and position himself for a performance review that he clearly expected to go well. It did not go well. The settlement conference happened in late April. I won't share the specific figure because it's part of the agreement, but I can say that the wrongful dismissal compensation, combined with the damages for the use of my intellectual property and the disruption to my career trajectory, amounted to something that genuinely changed my financial picture. My colleague at the Toronto firm reviewed the terms. My sister sat with me on the phone while I signed. My boyfriend made dinner and we ate it quietly, and I kept waiting for the relief to arrive, fully, and it did. But it was slower than I expected. Quieter. Not like winning. More like setting something down that had been very heavy for a very long time. My boss returned to work in early May. He called me again, this time with no legal reason to be careful, and we spoke for almost an hour. He told me what had happened inside the company. He told me about the internal review and its findings. He told me what the regulatory body had communicated to the firm, and then he paused and said, "I want to ask you something." I waited. "The role I promised you," he said, "regional client lead, it's still open. I'd like to offer it to you again, properly this time, with a contract, with everything in writing." I was quiet for a long moment. "I'm at the Oakville firm now," I said. "They've been good to me." "I know," he said. "I'm asking anyway." I told him I needed a few days to think. I spoke to my boyfriend, to my sister, to my friend who had watched me pack my desk in February. I weighed the commute against the history, the salary against the trust, the role I had been promised against, the role I had been promised against the role I had already taken. In the end, I turned it down. Not because I was angry. I wasn't, not at him, but because the Oakville position was growing in ways I hadn't anticipated, and because I had learned something important in the space between February and May, that I had built something valuable enough that someone was willing to take it from me, and that the same ability that built it once could build something even better somewhere new. I heard through the professional network that these things always travel through eventually, that Preston had resigned from Castellan in late spring. I don't know what came next for him, and I find I don't spend much time wondering. What I do spend time on, when I think about that Thursday afternoon in February, is the sandwich. The fact that I finished my sandwich, that I didn't panic, didn't cry, didn't storm into his office, or fire off a response, or do any of the things that anger tells you to do when it first arrives. I had spent 18 months being careful. I had documentation I hadn't needed to use, a plan I hadn't needed to activate, a network I hadn't needed to call, and the moment arrived and I just reached for it. Quietly, like it had always been there waiting. My friend from the office texts me sometimes. She's still at Castellan, still on the same floor, still sitting across from the desk where I used to work. She sent me a photo in May of the view from the office window. Snow was finally melting. Those gray Ontario snowbanks turning to slush at the edges. And she wrote, "He's gone. You're good." I'm good, I really am. I'm 32 years old. I have a job that challenges me, a file of documentation I hope I never need again, and an absolute bone-deep certainty that the next person who underestimates me will not find the experience particularly comfortable. I finished the sandwich. That was the beginning of everything. I've thought about that sandwich more times than makes sense. A tuna sandwich on rye, going cold on the counter, while the rest of my professional life was apparently being decided by a text message from a man who had been in the building for 18 months. And I finished it. That detail keeps coming back to me, not because it was brave, but because it was the truest thing I did that entire day. There's something I've come to believe, not from a book or a podcast, or anything a person told me directly, but from living through it. The way things end up is rarely accidental. Preston didn't fail because the universe intervened. He failed because of choices, specific, documentable, entirely avoidable choices he made over 18 months. He reassigned accounts without paperwork. He presented other people's thinking as his own. He fired a 6-year employee by text message 13 days before her promotion, without a meeting, without cause, without a single conversation. Every one of those decisions was a choice, and every one of them left a mark somewhere. I didn't plan my response out of bitterness. I want to be clear about that. The documentation I kept wasn't revenge in the making. It was just what a person with any sense does when they watch someone in power behave badly. You write it down. You keep the emails. You record the conversation where your boss tells you the promotion is yours. Because you're not naive enough to think a verbal promise survives a medical leave. That's not cynicism. That's just knowing how the world works and deciding to work within it carefully. What I learned, though, is that careful isn't enough on its own. You also have to be honest about what's happening, honest with the people who can help you, honest about what you want and what you're worth. I almost didn't call my sister that February evening. I almost told myself I was overreacting, that restructuring happens, that maybe I should just take the severance and move quietly. That voice is so easy to listen to. It sounds like humility, but it isn't. It's just fear wearing a reasonable face. And then there's the matter of staying upright when everything is uncertain. The 6 weeks between that Thursday and the settlement conference were not comfortable weeks. I was starting a new job in Oakville, learning new systems, meeting new people, all while a legal process was running in the background that I couldn't talk about at work. There were evenings when I wasn't sure it was going to land the way my sister's colleague thought it would. I kept going anyway, not because I was certain, but because the alternative, sitting down, going quiet, letting it pass, felt like something I wouldn't be able to look back on without regret. My boss called it correctly, I think, when he said Preston didn't know what he was taking on. But I don't think he meant my legal contacts or my documentation or my boyfriend's professional network. I think he meant the sandwich. The fact that I sat down, finished my lunch, and then got to work. That's the thing Preston miscalculated, not the paperwork. The person,